is a riff on public transportation in Kyiv. It's both informative, telling about my life, and a metaphor for a simpler, less materialistic way of life. This is the kind of life that America's tree huggers advise for everybody else, but of course usually don't live themselves. In a sense, my life in Kyiv is a living rebuke to progressives who would like to tell everybody else how to live. By design, Kyiv is a very compact city of 4 million. The Soviets simply didn't have the productivity to support an automotive society. They built a city of apartment blocks. The originals were walk-ups, a maximum of about 6 stories. In the Khrushchev years, they started to have elevators and became taller. Now the average is 25 to 30 stories. Western observers like to characterize these as soulless concrete blocks. From the outside they may be, but inside they can be quite cozy. Before building our American-style single-family house, I lived in 2 lovely immediate post-war apartments in the center of town that were more livable than any apartment I've had in the United States. Nobody owned their apartments in the Soviet era. They were assigned according to where you worked. The Soviets made sure there were lots of playgrounds and schools nearby. They wanted to ensure that they had soldiers and taxpayers in the next generation. They were not bad places to raise kids. My wife has fond memories of her Soviet childhood in the 1980s. The private builders of the modern era do not concern themselves much with playgrounds or schools. The apartments are spacious and comfortable, but they don't have many accommodations for kids. In this, Kyiv unfortunately echoes Western European cities. Kyiv is ethnically homogeneous. No ethnic neighborhoods means no really bad neighborhoods. This in turn means that there is no great compulsion to move outside the city to escape dangerous streets or bad schools. And as a consequence, there are no bad elements on the metro and buses. The middle class rides them without fear. Women may not like the jostle and noise, but fear is not a factor keeping people off public transportation. The result is an extremely efficient system of subway/metro, electric trains to the suburbs, trolleys, electric buses, big diesel city buses, and the ubiquitous jitney buses called marshrutkas. There's also a big and inexpensive fleet of taxis. In 10 years of living in Kyiv, I have never felt the need to buy a car. In fact, I'm usually somewhat apprehensive when somebody offers me a ride someplace to spare me from taking public transportation. Cars get stuck in traffic. Cars are dangerous. With the public transit, I can predict exactly when I'll arrive. Because metros travel in straight lines, whereas the cars have to zigzag this way and that, it's often faster to take public transportation. Almost nothing is new, but it all works. The public bus I ride may be held together with Bondo. It must be 20 years old, but it still works. The Ukrainians have a genius for maintenance. They don't dispose of things according to any amortization schedule, but only when they are really truly worn out. I relatively often hear a transmission in need of repair, brake linings that need replacement, or a muffler with a hole in it. I have yet, however, to be riding a bus that happened to break down. They usually put the same driver in the same machine day after day, and that driver is an acute judge of what needs to be fixed and what can wait. Public transportation is a great social bond. I see all the people in my neighborhood on a regular basis and say hello to them. How much better this is than simply dodging cars. It gives me an opportunity to speak Russian every day. It's even more important for my son. Instead of being strapped in a car seat and freighted around like a sack of potatoes, he is a full-fledged participant in society. He talks to everybody on the bus. Going back to the notion of a homogeneous society, the old ladies look at him as their asset, the next generation of their society. They love to talk to him. and he engages easily in conversation. He likes to sing songs on the bus. One of his favorites in Ukrainian is "There are two trees on the hill," a love song about the trees which twine together like a man and a woman who meet underneath them. And he also likes "The Wayward Wind" in English. That's Gogi Grant's song from the 1950s. Much to my surprise and delight, nobody has ever acted annoyed. Quite the contrary. They give him candy and coins for his singing. With public transit, we avoid the downside of cars. In the United States, people tried to run me off the road in fits of road rage. I would often steam in anger at the cars, whose drivers I could not see inside their steel boxes. They were probably thinking evil thoughts about me as well. Here, face to face, we have to be civil with one another. One of the threats to modern Kyiv is that people are getting richer and there are more and more cars on the road. It slows the buses down. This is the tragedy of the commons being played out. Public transit here is remarkably cheap. Every mode of transportation that I mentioned costs between 15 and 20 American cents. Taxis here are also quite cheap. $4 will get you clear to the other side of the city. $15 will get you to the airport. The cost of owning a car, on the other hand, is roughly comparable to what it costs in the United States. Kids start to ride the bus by themselves at about the age of 9 or 10. I don't see any danger to the children on the streets, but there are scare stories circulating here about children who have been kidnapped to have their organs harvested. This scare is unfortunate. Now, there were certainly pederasts running around when I was a kid in the 1940s, but we just didn't learn to worry about them until there were a couple of very sensationalized kidnappings and murders in the late 1950s. Our parents all of a sudden became much more protective. So even here, my kids don't have as much freedom as I did as a kid. Eddie's program may change next year. We're looking at a first grade for him that's only 2 bus stops away at the end of the line. The bus route is served by 3 machines and 5 drivers, and we know them all. It's about 1/8 of a mile walk to the bus stop, 1/4 mile from the bus to the school. If we were to choose that school, I don't think it would be too long before Eddie started to make the trip by himself. Now, public transportation wasn't a consideration when I grew up in Berkeley in the 1940s. My parents, and their parents before them, had always owned cars. Everybody did. The Key System trolley that ran through Berkeley went out of business shortly after my first ride in the late 40s. The San Francisco and Los Angeles suburbs were built in the era of the car with the assumption that everybody would own one. The pre-war Pasadena Freeway in Los Angeles had been America's first. The East Shore Freeway along the San Francisco Bay was completed in the mid-1950s. So, we walked a lot, we got driven when necessary, and rode our bicycles when we got old enough. We didn't take the bus. My parents, growing up in Los Angeles in the 1920s, likewise had little contact with public transportation. LA is a monumental sprawl, not dense enough to support a very good system. They drove. My grandmother, on the other hand, growing up in New York City before the turn of the 20th century, loved to ride the horse-drawn trolleys. She told us gleefully about riding downtown from her father's house in Midtown Manhattan, this was before they had skyscrapers, when she was about 10 years old. Nobody thought a thing about it. She and her sister knew the coachman and nobody saw any danger. My other grandmother, growing up in St. Louis, didn't talk about public transit, but she did describe crossing the Mississippi River, walking on the railroad trestle. There wasn't any provision for pedestrians, and when a train came along, they simply had to get down below the tracks and hang on while it went over them. Now, living as we do in a household of 7 people, relying on public transportation, I compute my carbon footprint to be about 5 tons a year. That's right around the world average. Far less than the average American tree hugger's 20 tons. We manage it because The society was so poorly managed from an economical point of view under the Soviets, and because it lacks the diversity that seems to compel hypocritical Americans to move so far out of the city to get away from the minorities that they express so much love for. Public transportation here is not only just about as fast and cheap as driving, but it is vastly more friendly to the environment and supports human connections that cars seem to destroy. It's a metaphor for many things that seem to have been better before being obliterated by America's supposed progress. Our transportation is more human. The interaction with merchants in the marketplace is more human. We have better human connections with the people in the neighborhood. And the kids make friends easily and without anxiety because they are all of the same stock. Maybe backwards is the new forwards. I prefer our lack of progress to what the progressives have wrought in the United States. That's my riff on transportation. Please, if you have any comments, leave them here or leave them on my LiveJournal site that you see in the subtitle. This is Graham Seibert signing off from Kyiv.